And we are, so everyone knows, we are recording this session. We had a lot of people who wanted to attend and want access to the information afterwards. So we're going to record. Certainly, if you want to remain anonymous during this training, you can turn your camera off. You can also change your display name. Although typically in the recording, it would be me, the person speaking, that remains visible. So, but just so you all know that we are recording. So welcome. This is just an hour session, so we're going to be really efficient with our time, and hopefully all of you had the chance to read the pre-reading. It's kind of the honor system. We're relying on you to, so if you completed the pre-reading, then consider yourself eligible for the full continuing education training. Quickly to introduce myself, I'm Jenny Stotts. I'm the director of the Athens County CASA Guardian Ad Litem program in Southeastern Ohio. And I have with me my two coworkers, Tara Huffman and Jess Chadwell, who are both volunteer coordinators here in our office. So if you have any technical issues, definitely feel free to shoot either Tara Huffman or Jess Chadwell a private message if you have any issues. We are going to keep everyone muted just to avoid the background noise, but that does not mean that we don't want to hear from you. So please feel free to use the chat box. Jess and Tara are both going to be monitoring that. And if they need to stop me at any point, they'll do that. Our expectations for this session, we just have an hour together. If you do have questions or want to discuss something further, the three of us, the facilitators, we're going to stay online until 1:30. So if you want to stay afterwards, if you have something you want to talk to us a little bit more deeply or have a question that you want to go over with us, we're going to stay on until about 1:30 today. So you would have time afterwards to hang around and ask questions in a smaller group. But just given how large our group is today, we're going to try and be efficient with our time. Other expectations for this session is that we really want to think a little bit deeper than trauma is bad for kids. I think that, we're all CASAs, we all know that, and really thinking more about how can this inform our decisions. We're also going to talk a bit about ACEs from the pre-reading. Obviously, we set this up that this is going to be a conversation centered around those adverse childhood experiences. But really, what are the implications for our practice and for our decision making? And really looking to elevate the importance of well-being, the well-being of the child in those child welfare processes to the same level as safety and permanency. And we're going to talk a lot about the intersection of safety and permanency and well-being. We also are going to talk about how much weight should the future health and well-being of a child, of a future adult, how much weight should that be given in the decisions that we're making today for these children? And we also know we have 1 hour to cover a ton. So this is just the beginning of the conversation, and we hope that it will be the start of you looking and investigating more on your own. So we're going to start with a video that I'm sure many of you have probably seen. And if you read the pre-reading, you know that Dr. Burke Harris was one of the contributors to that article. I'm sure many of you have seen her TED Talk that kind of puts the ACE study into really practical terms. We're going to watch it again because we're going to center a lot of our conversation around this. It's about 15 minutes. Also, every slide, every article that we mention or piece of research that we mention will be emailed to you directly following this session. So you'll have access to, if I mention a study, if I mention a statistic, or anything like that, you're going to get copies of everything at the end of this, including a link to this video if you want to use it again in the future. So here we go. This might be my internet connection. Hopefully we don't have an internet.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, It affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or pathogen chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failure.
Okay, let's see. Must not like
In the mid-90s,
Can everybody see that?
the CDC and CASA discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system,
with me. Sorry, guys.
Okay, sorry, it seems like we're not able to share the video. My internet kind of went out there for a second.
I just tried with mine too, Jenny, and it's not like it's stopping in the same spot.
That's okay. We'll pivot. And so you'll get access to the link afterwards. So we'll just go through, and then I hope that you'll all take the time. It's just like a 13-minute TED Talk, and watch that video at the end, but we'll make sure that everyone has the link to it. And certainly if you read any of the pre-reading, you'll have a general idea, but I'm going to reference some of the language that Dr. Burke-Harris uses as we move forward, and I'll point that out to you as we go. So we appreciate you all being flexible with us. Gotta love technology, don't we? Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen once again, and we'll go from there. Must be a bad day for the internet. Okay, so I don't know how far into Dr. Burke-Harris's video that you got, but she is actually a physician and became a Surgeon General. But she started this clinic and was really, she wasn't the creator of she wasn't one of the original researchers on the ACEs study. That was really the CDC, the Kaiser Permanente study, when we think about the ACEs study and understanding it. And Dr. Folletti really was the one to start asking the questions about what this looked like. And I have, at the end of this slideshow, I've shared all of the links to the original studies for you. So if you really want to deep dive into those. I also highly recommend the CDC's, the Center for Disease Control's website. They have a really great section on adverse childhood experiences. So when we think about ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, we tend to interchange that word with trauma quite a bit. And a lot of times we'll say, oh yeah, ACEs, and we kind of really are meaning to say trauma when we say that. But I want to, if you get to watch the TED Talk, and many of you probably have seen that TED Talk, it's a really popular one that helped bring ACEs in a way that was really digestible and understandable for people. And obviously Dr. Burke-Harris is very talented in her speaking and teaching abilities. But I wanted to share this graphic with you that you're seeing right now that just explains the mechanism of how someone having an adverse experience in their childhood can actually lead to heart disease, can lead to higher rates of cancer, can lead to higher rates of diabetes or other physical impairments or physical health issues, and then even shorten the life expectancy in some instances. So if you remember back to CASA pre-service training, there's a section in there where we talk about the various types of risk factors and how they interact with each other to create safety threats for children. So if you remember from pre-service training, all the way back in pre-service, we talked about child-related factors and parent-related factors, family-related, social, environmental, and typically it's not just one factor that leads to a safety threat for a child. It's the interaction of many factors. So you might have a child who's at particularly higher risk for one reason or another, a parent who is under extreme stress, and then there's some social or environmental thing that happens, like they lose their job or their housing or, you know, a death in the family. And it's kind of all these factors come together and it creates this storm, this kind of perfect storm where then there's this safety threat or this risk that emerges as a result. And so that's when you see the bottom of this pyramid, that's really what's at play there. You have this kind of generational dynamic, this historical trauma, these social conditions, this kind of context that's happening. And then that leads to these adverse childhood experiences. And it could range anywhere from experiencing abuse or neglect, which is what we're talking about today mostly, but it could also be the death of someone close in your family, a disruption in your family. It could be like a divorce or a move or something like that. And it's when these build up over time. And one thing I really like about the TED Talk that we will definitely share with you afterwards is that she explains those in the context of doses. So the more doses of adverse childhood experiences you have, the higher likelihood that you might have impairments or have health-related implications later on. And so this explains the mechanism of how that happens. And so I'm gonna use the pointer function here. So this explains the mechanism of how that happens. So we have these disruptions in neurodevelopment, and then that leads to this impairment, these social impairments, cognitive impairments. And then in many cases, we see this behavioral implication, right? The adoption of health risk behaviors, like someone starts smoking or something like that. And then all of that kind of spirals from there. In this next graphic, which is also will be emailed to you, I like this one because it kind of explains how adverse childhood experiences, what it can lead to if unaddressed. So we all kind of recognize, let's say, mental health. How many of us are working with parents as CASA right now, working with parents who struggle with depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder, or working with people who have histories of suicide attempts or suicidal ideation, self-harming behaviors? Another one that I think we see play out a lot are, alcohol and drug abuse. How many times when we're working with a parent and we look through, we kind of get to know them, get to know their history a little bit, everything they've experienced in their life. And you think to yourself, well, it kind of makes sense. I can see how you ended up at this place where we're having these struggles that we're having now. And the only thing I wish this graphic had is I wish each of these things were connected, right? Because there's so much interplay between this. And we could get into probably a day-long conversation of chicken or the egg. Is it that adverse childhood experiences lead to disruptions in mental health and then that leads to risky behaviors? Or does the risky behavior happen and then that So there's a lot of interplay between these that makes this conversation very complex, but also very interesting. So let's just think about this in the context of CASA for a second. So how does ACEs, or adverse childhood experience, or trauma typically impact our decisions and practices? This is what I see in my work, both here in Athens County, all around Ohio, and really around the country when I talk about trauma and talk about ACEs with child professionals. So we are really, really good at exploring and investigating historical trauma as part of the primary fact-finding tasks, right? That's one of the first things we do, right? When we get that case, we read all the file, we read all the information we can find, we ask questions about that history. We're also really good about making good recommendations for services, right? We know when counseling is probably a good idea, or when maybe a different type of counseling might better serve this child or family. We also use ACEs, we might not use this terminology, but we use ACEs, I think, as a lens to understand parent behavior. I think that we can probably look at a way that maybe a parent is disciplining their child and read that through the lens of what their own experiences were. We also, I think, have done a really good job across the CASA network of implementing trauma-informed practices. So I know here in my office, we've changed some of our forms, we've changed our website, some of the practices that we have in the courthouse in order to be more trauma competent and more trauma informed. So I think we've done pretty good about that. But let's stretch a little bit. Let's think a little bit deeper. I think a little bit bigger. How often do we think about long-term health consequences for children based on the decisions that we make today? Like, how often are we really thinking about this child's future, heart health based on the conversations and based on the decisions that we're making today? And then how can we move beyond just using ACEs as the shorthand for trauma and really thinking about the long-term implications of the current circumstances that we see before us? And then my next kind of question or conversation starter is there a time limit on best interest considerations? Are we talking about best interests right now, in the next hour, in the next 10 years, in the next 18 years? Are we thinking about best interests in the course of a child's entire life, all the way to adulthood, their entire lifespan? I don't know. So let's just consider a couple of things. Should the long-term health of the children that we currently serve be a factor in determining best interests? And if anyone has a really strong immediate opinion to that, I'd love for you to put it in the chat box, because that's what we're going to center our conversation around today. And again, this is the beginning of the conversation. I think that, here in child welfare in the juvenile justice system, when we think about safety, I think we're really good at that. I think we do a pretty good job. We're not perfect, right? There are times we miss the mark and children are not safe. But I think our systems are designed for children to be safe, right? We have all these mechanisms, we have all these tools, lots of training, right? We have an entire child welfare workforce trained in how to assess and keep children safe. We have all these legal mechanisms to keep children safe. We have safety plans, we have substitute care, we have court-ordered protective supervision to compel caregivers to comply with safety measures. I also think we're really good at permanency. We have this entire legal infrastructure centered around permanency, right? We have the 12 of 22 rule, right? Kids can't linger in temporary care forever. We have all these timelines, right? There's this pressure on the court and on child protection to move things along so that we're not kind of just plopping along and keeping kids in care forever. So I think we do pretty good at those things. A place where I think we have an opportunity to do a little bit better is in well-being. And that's not the low-hanging fruit. Well-being is much more fluid. It's much more difficult, much more difficult to wrap our minds around. What does well-being mean? Now, for today's conversation, I want us to think about safety and permanency and well-being as a three-legged stool. These are not mutually exclusive things. They should not be treated as if they're in silos. They all interact with one another. And I think I would venture, I challenge that health, the child's health forever, I think it is a factor of safety. I think it's also a factor of permanency. And it's certainly most obviously a factor in well-being. And I think we need to make decisions at the intersection of all three of these things. That's what we're going to talk about today. Great. And I'm loving the comments. Thank you for those of you that are contributing to the conversation in the chat box. Please feel free to fill that up. So how can we apply the evidence that we know from the ACE study, from that original Kaiser Permanente study, to our practice while continuing to operate within the boundaries of law, within the boundaries of those best interest principles, and within the boundaries of our child welfare practices? What can we do? How can we be doing things differently? And it's interesting because when we think about the law and we use the term best interests a lot, there's not a lot of clear guidance within the law on what best interest is. Is best interest right now? Is it, for the next 18 years of this child's life? Is it their best interest forever? There's not a lot of guidance in that. We kind of have this guiding principle, and thinking of that as like beacon lights, right? And we kind of try to operate within that and make sure that we're considering every factor. And I think this is applying the knowledge and applying the research from the ACE study and just what we know about trauma in general is a really great way to strengthen our practice and to kind of level up, so to speak, in the work that we're doing. Because I know we're all already doing great work. And so as we're talking about this today and moving through the next couple of examples, I don't want anyone to walk away thinking that I'm questioning how impactful the work that we're doing is already. I'm just saying, let's stretch a little bit. What could we be doing more? So I'm going to go through with 3 examples, and I hope that you will fill up the chat box, or if you're not into typing and you want to unmute, just there's a raise hand feature that you can use and do that. So the example is the 2-year-old is going home. The parents completed each task on their case plan, including the required number of counseling sessions, whatever that was, 3 months of sobriety as verified by negative drug screens, and they've secured stable housing. But all the professionals in the case, like the CASA, the caseworker, the attorney, the counselor, all those people, we all know in our guts that it will be just a matter of time before that child enters foster care again. Has anyone had this experience where we say somewhat kind of defeated, somewhat jaded, like, right, flippantly, we say, oh gosh, it'll just be a matter of time before we see this family again. I don't feel good about this. I know I've certainly heard those conversations in my career. And so what I want to talk about is the implications of this is, I'm not trying to say children shouldn't go home. I'm not saying reunification isn't a good idea, but rather, what could we be doing to strengthen that family to help support a successful and permanent reunification? What can we be doing to strengthen safety, permanency, and well-being? And should we be openly discussing our concerns about this potential recidivism? Should we be talking about this in court? Should we be talking about this with the family of saying, we're really worried that things seem really stable right now, but we're concerned that it might not stay that way? And, when we say it's just a matter of time before this family's involved again, we say that so flippantly. What we're really saying is it's just a matter of time before this child experiences more trauma. That's really what we're saying when we say that. And so, what I wrestle with is what's informing our gut on this? What's making us in our gut somewhere say, it's just a matter of time before we're going to see this family again? What assessments are we missing? What questions, what discussions aren't we having? And I can see the chat box filling up there, so I want to look through what everyone's saying here. And if anyone wants to add to the conversation or respond to any of, I know I'm trying to ask very provocative questions because I want us to have really good conversation, even just internal dialogue about this. Yeah, so someone's questioning kind of that minimum sufficient level of care. And does that leave out child well-being? Absolutely, that's a great question to be asking. Great. Oh, so Jason raises a really good question that I see happening a lot, is, you as the CASA, you read every scrap of paper you can get your hands on. At least that's my experience with the CASAs I work with. But sometimes caseworkers, therapists, counselors, or other care providers don't always know the history. I know I've certainly called up a counselor and said, oh, well, what about, this thing that happened when they were living with their aunt and uncle? And that provider had no idea that had happened. So sometimes as the CASA, we might just be advocating to make sure that everyone knows the information they need to know to be able to help that child. Yep, making sure that we're addressing that intergenerational trauma. Very good. Yep, so questioning just, kind of there, that's a hard, Lori shares about 3 months of sobriety. Is that long enough? What's that mean? That's hard when we're talking about, a parent that's struggling through their recovery. How much time is enough time to feel really confident in their recovery?
Jenny, there was one point that someone had asked or made about how do we make that, what does it look like for us in the court system? Like, what would how will lawyers handle this? Like, what does it look like for us to address this?
So I think a great, when we're having this kind of, it's in our gut, we have this feeling, I think that we need to move, because it's not necessarily in our gut. Something that we're seeing or observing or something we know about the history is what's informing our gut. So I think we need to take the conversation out of our guts and put it on the table a little bit, so to speak, and to have those conversations of, you know, I'm seeing that there's a good bit of stability right now. Things are on the right track and moving forward. But based on the history, based on what we know about recovery, based on what we know about the science of relapse, I am very concerned about X, Y, and Z. What are some ideas that we can put forward to address this and to prevent this from happening? And if a relapse happens, what's our relapse plan? What are we going to do to make sure that this child is okay as we move forward? So I think when we have those in our gut type reactions and really think, what is my gut looking at? What are these assessments that are actually happening? And how can we talk about them? And I'm a big fan of talking about things really openly with families. I think the magnitude of our work is too important to try to avoid having those difficult and critical conversations. So I think really thinking back to what are these assessments? What are we really seeing? What is it that's causing this concern? And most likely it's going to be a combination of what we see, what we know of this family's past or of this parent's past, perhaps, and what the science tells us, what the research tells us about addiction recovery, what it tells us about, you know, future implications for abuse, and have conversations about that really, really openly. And someone made a really excellent point in the chat box about letting parents know that they can seek assistance or seek help or support without the fear of, you know, kind of getting in trouble all over again, or seeing that their children are going to be removed from them if they ask for help. Okay. And I keep the conversation going. And if those of you that are able to stay after and want to talk more about this, I'm loving that you're all adding into this. So our next example is, this is a 15-year-old who's been in foster care for 10 months. He attends counseling weekly, equine assisted therapy bi-weekly, individual visits with each parent because the parents don't get along with one another, monthly visits with the caseworker, the CASA, maybe visits with his siblings. And his routine, his entire life, largely revolves around school, the foster home, visits with various relatives, counseling, visits with service providers, et cetera, et cetera. So what's missing in this picture? What's wrong with this picture? I'm interested I'll give you all a minute to fill up the chat box. What are some things we're missing? Do you think that we as CASA, or we as the system, the quote unquote system, do we have a responsibility to build healthy, joyful experiences for youth and teens in foster care? Do we think that's an important step in those building blocks of resilience? How important is it? And, you know, how does this relate to what we know about ACEs or what we know about trauma? Right. Yeah. So someone said it perfectly. Jeannie, it looks like he needs time to be a 15-year-old. Absolutely. Needs friends, activities, you know, kind of that normalcy. Awesome. Yeah, Julie, what does he do for fun? That's a great question to ask. You should always ask every child that. What do you do for fun? Yep, David said lots of structure. Absolutely. You know, and this is an interesting thing, and I recognize that I might open a can of worms here, but most children in foster care don't have cell phones. Most of them don't have social media. And so regardless of our feelings about those technologies, I know that there are very heated opinions, both directions, on children and teens having social media or having technology. But regardless, it is how a lot of teens and youth socialize and connect with one another. So what are we doing to allow him to build those peer connections? What are we doing to allow him to have social relationships with people that are his own age? You know, if he's not involved with sports or extracurriculars or, you know, any of those, how are we fostering those connections for him? Are really, really great questions to ask. Yeah, Sarah shares the social media connections are more important probably during this pandemic. And it's a hard balance to strike, right? Between how do we keep kids safe, because right, technology is terrifying. But then how can we kind of allow all of these things? Yep, someone says that they maybe have some policy within their own local jurisdiction that won't allow cell phones or personal computer time, anything like that. And obviously, I'm not here to tell you, I know there are some rules that have to be followed. What I always say, if that's the rule and there's no way to have an exception to that rule, what are we doing outside of that? Because just saying no social media, for example, that's a rule that a lot of families even have. What are we doing to make sure that that child has an opportunity to build peer relationships? Because that's an important building block of resilience for them later to overcome some of the adversities and move forward past some of the adversities that they have. So a lot of you had really great questions. You know, what do you do for fun? How are you building relationships with people? What do you enjoy doing right now? How are you staying connected? Those are really great questions. Rochelle shares, needs to be the whole child, right? Not just that. That's again where we get back to that safety and permanency. That whole child's whole life is about safety, healing from all the adversity, all the trauma they've experienced, moving through, the case, doing all the steps, checking all the boxes. And we're not really looking at a lot of those deeper well-being things that happen outside of a counselor's office. Because, all those other things that happen in a child's life are important for building resilience and helping them cope with the very serious things that they're dealing with. Yeah, so I think, Lori shares that it doesn't always seem like a priority, that those kind of fun or social connections are the priority. And I think that goes back to we're really slanted as a juvenile welfare system in looking at safety, looking at permanency. And it's a lot to manage those. So I think that's a role that CASA can play very uniquely, is asking those questions of what can we do? I understand there's a rule. I understand there are certain guidelines. What can we do to make sure that we're building these important connections for this young person? There's just something about allowing someone to experience joy instead of just kind of saying, let's just get them through this so that they can be an adult. And I think CASAs are a really special part of the juvenile justice and the child welfare system. Yeah, so Donna asked a good question. Yes.
I was going to just make one other point about making sure everybody is making the connection that we're talking about, the things that we can do for children when they're home or when they're in foster care, or both, or some in foster care and some at home. We're wanting to do these things so it's a lifelong situation for them to build for them, and not necessarily just when they're in foster care. What can we do to help with ACEs? Or, it follows them home. That's what we want, Reunification is always the first goal. We all know children do better in their own homes with their parents when they're keeping them safe. And that's what everybody wants, but just making that clarification that it's not just focusing on the ACEs and what we can do for them in foster care, that it's something that we want to follow them throughout their lives.
Absolutely. And when we say I use the terms building the blocks of resilience a lot, those are forever, right? We're building those tools for that child to use forever. So what a better time than when they're in this really supportive kind of wraparound environment, hopefully, for us to be able to give them every tool we can think of so that they can move through the rest of their lives in a healthy and successful way. Someone asked a good question in the chat box of having a very difficult time after visitations and acting out. I'm going to get to your question here in a second, so I'll just put a pin in that for right now. One more example. So the 9-year-old is in the permanent custody of Children's Services and has been in and out of foster care for most of her life. She's chronically constipated to the point of multiple episodes of impaction. Her foster parent took her to the doctor, of course, and now she's on a special diet. She's taking daily stool softeners, and she occasionally has to take laxatives to regulate her digestion. She continues to experience this constipation, and sometimes she even refuses to go to the bathroom because bowel movements have become painful. the foster parent reports that when she does go, she ties up the bathroom for a really long time, which is a problem in their really full house and perhaps only having one bathroom. So what's our responsibility here? Does anyone have any off-the-cuff reactions to this particular example? You know, what responsibility do we have? What questions would we be asking? So one question in my mind.
I have a reaction to this,
Yes,
Jenny, only because I worked with this so closely with so many kiddos, and I don't think we take it seriously enough. I mean, I feel like we are in court hearings and people are talking about children being constipated and having problems with their bowel movements like it's like nothing. And I feel so much for children who are dealing with like this health issue. This is like an uncomfortable problem to have for anybody. And to think that we just are like, well, let's put them on more laxatives, or they're refusing to go, or they're taking too much time. It really frustrates me. I feel like maybe because of, there's so many other problems that this one kind of gets pushed to the side, or like not given enough weight on how uncomfortable this could make a child. And so it's really frustrating for me, because I see it all the time and I talk about it all the time. And I always advocate for like, can we get a specialist for this child? This should not be happening for years of this child's life. So yes, I have an opinion about it.
Constantly in discomfort, right? Because we tend to judge children in foster care, children and teens in foster care by their behavior, because that's what we see most obviously. So think of all the times that we would talk about their behavior, and imagine if they were having those behaviors in the context of being basically indefinitely uncomfortable. And so I love all the questions that you're all putting into the chat box. And if you've ever faced this issue in a case, I hope that you'll think about asking these questions. And what obviously we're not doctors. Some of you might be doctors. I'm not a doctor. Of really taking a step back and circling back to making sure everybody knows about this child's experiences, that history, right? Making sure everyone that is making decisions about this child is informed about that history. But I think, maybe making a suggestion of more of a multi-pronged approach to supporting this child, one that includes maybe some emotional support, maybe some therapy. Some of you mentioned, about talking to counselors and therapists about this issue, because so many times we think, okay, that's a bowel issue. This is not, I hear some feedback. I just want to make sure okay. Sorry about that. Making sure that we're not just looking at this as just a physical health issue, making sure everyone has this information. So maybe a multi-pronged approach that includes emotional support, includes medical treatment, maybe includes some habit changes. But one that I think is important is addressing with the foster parent and perhaps even the school or anywhere else this child spends time about not putting time limits on the bathroom. Some of you mentioned about the impact that can result from the constipation, right? Like all of the things that could be affected. But imagine, even if the child's not necessarily getting in trouble for spending so much time in the bathroom, but what if it's constantly being drawn attention to oh gosh, Lucy's in the bathroom again, it'll be an hour before she gets out. Imagine what that would do, what that would reinforce, the feedback loop that would create over time. I personally, if anyone is an educator in here, I understand why this happens in schools, but I'm not a big fan of making kids raise their hand and announce to their entire classroom that they need to use the bathroom and then being told they only have 5 minutes. I think that that's really concerning to me. So it might be, I understand why that's important. I understand that kids would just go and play. But maybe with a specific child that's experiencing this, having a gentle private conversation with the people that this child spends time with about how we can be supportive of them. And I think really looking at this from every direction, looking at the emotional component, looking at the medical component, looking at, what changes could be made in like diet, exercise, those types of things. Right? We can all like take our grandma's advice of just drink some more water, and putting all of those things together and creating an environment where we are taking this seriously and we are making sure that the people who can help are really connected with this child and have the full story. Because perhaps the foster parent or the parent, when they take the child to the doctor, they're thinking this is just a stomach issue. And they're not thinking to mention necessarily that, hey, this child has this whole host of experiences. Someone mentioned a possible history of sexual abuse, those types of things. So yeah, I appreciate, Jan, your comment about, she's only 9, making sure that we're being really gentle and sensitive as we move forward, because the way we react to this, how seriously we take this, how we talk to her about it, we're kind of setting her up, right, for her life of how she's going to feel about this particular issue. Wendy reinforces again the communication. Thank you, Wendy, for sharing that just the communication of everybody is sometimes the missing step. Even when we go back to one of the other examples, someone mentioned about the child, people working with the child not necessarily knowing about the history, not necessarily knowing about the trauma history or the history of removals or things like that, making sure that the people who need the information to make good decisions for this child have that information. Okay. I appreciate how much you all are contributing to the chat. I think that's probably the chat box will be one of the most valuable pieces of this training, because all of you are sharing so much of your own experiences and lessons learned. Okay, so let's think about what we can do to level up in our work. And this is not an end-all be-all list. This is just some things I thought of, the questions we can ask, things we can do. Feel free to keep adding to the chat box. I think one very basic thing that we can do as CASA is to make sure that we're openly discussing ACEs and talking about it in a non-judgmental, very compassionate way. But ask therapeutic providers about it. Ask them what they think about this child's history, how they see that impacting their treatment moving forward. And again, anyone who makes decisions for this child's life should have an understanding, in my opinion, of their adverse childhood experiences, should have an understanding of what's being brought to the table for this particular child. Because I think we've all gotten really good about, we did the trauma training. We understand trauma-informed care. We understand trauma competence. But are we really applying it to every specific child and using that specific child's experience and that specific child's history as the lens by which we assess and make decisions? And I know sometimes I can say that I haven't done that. If I'm being really honest with myself, and you're all friends here, so I think I can be honest with you too, but sometimes we do get in a hurry and we do just want to move things along, and really taking the time to think, how does this child's experiences, how is that going to be different for this particular child, and how we make decisions for this particular child? And those might be different decisions or different recommendations for even siblings, right? Because we know every child trauma is not how we observe it or we see it, it's how the child or the person experiences it. And that's very different. That's a very individualized experience. I think especially thinking about the decisions we make that have long-term implications is critically important to consider this. And I hope I started this conversation talking about safety, permanency, and well-being. And I hope that you've all recognized that I think health is definitely a factor in all three of those things. It's definitely a factor in safety, definitely a factor in permanency, and definitely a factor in well-being. And I think we've got to get comfortable and we've got to find the language and find the communication to have open conversations about the implications of occurrences, of reoccurrences of abuse and neglect. I think that we should, and maybe this isn't necessarily our job to have these conversations directly with a parent, but I think we should advocate for parents to understand adverse childhood experiences. They don't need to know the whole study, but understanding how future doses, right? Future doses of ACEs can have these long-term implications for their children, and having conversations with them about it. And I think that conversation is probably a little bit simpler to have than to just say, keep your child safe, right? That's so big, keep your child safe. And really talking through, there are lots of things that can create adverse experiences for anyone. Here are the things that we know can have really negative consequences for your child's long-term health, long-term well-being. And here are some things that we could do together. Here are some things that you can do as a parent. Here are resources that are available to help minimize those risks as much as possible. And I think having conversations with parents in that kind of way, in an informational way of partnering with them, is a really good first step. Obviously, there are some case situations where that doesn't make much sense, but especially when we're talking about children going home and wanting them to stay home permanently and wanting them to stay home safely and wanting them to be healthy in the long run. I think those are important conversations that we should be having, or that we should be advocating to be occurring. And finally, just some food for thought, things to think about, and then we'll open up some conversations here. But ask yourself, with every child that you work with, does their foster parent or their caregiver, wherever they are, do they understand ACEs? But do they understand ACEs and the implications for this specific child? And that again goes back to that communication factor. And do we consider that we are potentially adding doses, right? We're adding more opportunities for adverse childhood experiences when we make decisions based on parent compliance rather than child best interests. So, I know in my work, I've seen a lot of times where we tend to view visits as a reward for good parent behavior. And I think that's a dangerous tactic to take. I think that, the law certainly says children and parents visit because parents have the right to visit, right? They're exercising their right to visit with their child. And that's the law. I'm not disregarding that. I'm saying for us, as the child advocate, as the CASA perspective, when we look at visits, we need to look at it from the perspective of this child has the right and the need to have safe connections with their family. That's why we visit. That's why we want children to be able to visit their parents or visit their siblings or visit their relatives. And so really thinking about how can we maintain those important connections for the child? And someone asked a really good question about children having a reaction after a visit. And I know in my experience, a lot of times there's a push for when a child, say they have a phone call with their mom, and then every time they have a phone call, they cry for 20 minutes afterwards. And the foster parent or caregiver or whoever is kind of saying, well, they're really upset after visits. They're crying a lot after the visits, or they're crying a lot after these phone calls. And how often is our knee-jerk reaction to just stop those phone calls because they're triggering for the child, they're causing the child to be upset. And I understand that there are times where visits or contact with a relative is extremely troubling. And so I'm not talking about those situations where it's really extreme, but I'm talking about children that have very human reactions to human experiences, and us allowing and supporting them through those human reactions. And being the person to say, it actually makes a lot of sense that, Lucy cries when she gets off the phone with her mom. I think she misses her mom. What are some activities or rituals that we could build into after those visits to help support her through those? What coaching could we give her mom to maybe have a more smooth ending of those phone calls, or maybe even something as simple as making a plan for the next contact. If the parent's reliable, we don't want to make promises that can't be kept with the child. But if the parent has demonstrated that they're really reliable, asking the parent to build into the end of their phone call of, hey, 24 more hours, and then we're going to talk on the phone again because I'm going to call you tomorrow at 7 o'clock. And now I understand there's a whole other host of things that happen when I'm not talking about when parents say they're going to attend a visit and then for whatever reason don't, but talking about, I don't know that our first reaction should always be to stop all that contact. In some instances, that's what's healthiest for that child and safest for that child. But in many cases, it's a matter of how can we better support that child so that they can experience those very human emotions to that very human experience. And I'm going to stop for a second and check some of the Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that the comment that Terry made about sometimes it shows us that we need to move a little faster. Sometimes, if everything is going smoothly and the parents are doing what they need to do, why do we need to have a month of a visitation schedule? Like, why can't we just kind of move a little bit quicker? So that's a great point.
Yeah. And, I know, when I've experienced a loss, like crying is a pretty normal thing. And we even tell that to grown adults. It's okay to cry. Sometimes you need to cry. And I think we can give that same permission to children too. And I also recognize that I'm saying that as the person who's not the foster parent, who has maybe other children that need their attention as well. So being willing to get creative and kind of talk about it a little bit of saying, okay, if visits need to pause for a day or two so we can regroup, what's the plan to get those back going again? My last kind of food for thought, if you will, is, are we looking at every placement change as another dose? So when we think of ACEs, we tend to think of things that happened while the child was at home, right? We're thinking about the physical abuse and the neglect and the parents' drug use and absence and sexual abuse and all of those really horrible things that happen to children. But are we really thinking that sometimes our intervention can have the same implication on the long-term outcomes? Now, very needed interventions, right? We don't remove children just because we feel like it. We remove them from their families because of very serious concerns. But are we thinking about how our interventions can have those same long-term health implications as those that result from abuse or neglect? Are we looking at those decisions and advocating for that child from that perspective, seeing it as that magnitude? One thing I think that's really important here is, I worked in child welfare myself. I was a caseworker for a long time before I came to CASA. So was Tara, actually. And, I know what it's like when a foster placement has disrupted. I never say a child disrupts, the foster placement disrupted, not the child. But the foster placement disrupts. And then we're scrambling to try and find another foster family that will accept the placement. And, you're kind of, right, you're trying to convince them of, hey, this, we're going through all the, because we have to review all the behaviors that this child's ever had, all of these concerns. And I think sometimes I don't think it's intentional. I don't think that. I think we have a really good child protection workforce in Ohio. I think that it's a matter of trying to find a place for this child to go, because we know what happens when we don't have a foster home available. Scary things happen. Children have to go places we don't want them to go. So I think sometimes I wouldn't say we minimize, but we, to a degree, minimize some of the what to expect. So I think us as CASA, having that conversation early on with a new caregiver, particularly if a child's moved a couple times, of saying, this is a child who is not going to respond well to future disruptions. And here are some of the things that you might see. What's the plan for how we're going to address those and how we're going to respond to these things that come up, so that we can all, as a team, be supportive and move through these things, because this child can't experience another dose. We can't give them another dose. We can't give them another disruption. So I think having those conversations, front loading those conversations a little bit, is an important thing that we can do, just to make a plan. Even telling the foster parent, when Lucy was in her last foster home, she had a lot of instances where, when she was feeling really upset and feeling really out of control, where she spread feces on the walls. That's something that happened frequently. Obviously, that's really distressing to you as a caregiver. I'm just curious, what's your plan if that were to happen again? How do you think you might respond? What support do you think you would need? What plan could we have in place ready to go for if this starts happening? And that's just an example, but kind of talking through those things really openly with a caregiver might be an important thing that we could do as CASA to help prepare and maybe avoid some of those future disruptions, if we can, for the child. So my challenge to you in the last couple minutes as we wrap up and you go on, again, Tara, Jess, and I are going to stay on for about the next half hour if you have specific questions and want to talk. I wish that we could have really dove a little bit deeper during our 1 hour today, but I hope that you will just view this as a conversation starter. I tried to make ask really provocative questions that would get us thinking and kind of evoke some response. So I hope that you'll just commit to learning as much as you can about each specific child, but also just about this body of research. There's a ton of work being done around this right now that's helping us understand how this works even better. So commit to learning as much as you can. I also hope that you will be that person buzzing about ACEs or buzzing about trauma, buzzing about all these things in every recommendation, in every assessment, in every decision, and really thinking about this. I love Dr. Burke-Harris's comments about looking at this in the context of doses. I think that's a really great way to look at this. And really working hard not to treat safety, permanency, and well-being as isolated concepts, but really looking at them as intersecting and looking at the child as the center of those. And each one is elevated to the same level of importance. Here in a few minutes, here in about a half an hour, check your email. You will get a training evaluation. We appreciate your feedback in that training evaluation. Once you complete that, you'll get your training certificate if you need that for your training hours. But we do appreciate your feedback. We're constantly offering these trainings each month, and we really want to be responsive to what you need and how we can be better. So please complete that. And finally, you'll also in that email get a copy of this, which has links to the original Folletti study, the ACE Kaiser Permanente study, which is the one Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris references, tons of other resources out there to help you wrap your head around this and understand it a little bit more, and maybe get some good ideas for conversations to have. And if you really want to nerd out on this, here are some important pieces of research that I think are important for us to know, or at least to understand. Some of them get a little deep into the statistics of this, but the summaries are great, and it's a great way to just continue your learning. Of course, we would love to be friends forever, so we would hope that you will check out our website. We post all of our trainings on there, as well as you can follow us on any social media platform. We're on all the big ones, I think, at Athens CASA, and we do post our trainings there. We also have a private but not confidential Facebook group for CASA volunteers. It's searchable at SEO CASA on Facebook, and it's private, not confidential, but we post trainings, important information, things like that there, and you are all very, very welcome to participate in that with us. Otherwise, we're going to stay on for about the next half hour. That concludes our training. We hope that it was informative. Thank you for bearing with our with all of our technical issues there at the beginning. We'll make sure everyone has a link to that great video. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see y'all later. And if you're interested in hanging around, we will be on. Bye, everyone.
So Jenny,
Yes.
I've been reading this book, Trauma and Recovery,
Mhm.
and well, I finished reading it, and it goes along with the ACEs. I found it very informative and very helpful. Just realizing how, from top to bottom, how trauma really informs, like, issues will come up later that you think that have been put to rest.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Great. I saw someone asked about a transcript of the chat. I think that there's a way for me to download a transcript of the chat, and I will do that and send that along in the after email for anyone. But thanks for sharing that book. Who's the author of that, Julie?
The author is Judith Herman.
Okay, great. Thanks. So any other questions or comments, or maybe more specific things that any of you wanted to discuss that you stuck around after for? Maybe no, everyone's muted.
I can ask a question.
Yes.
I'm a new CASA. I just started. I have my first case. I as of this month. And
Thank you. First of all, thank you for volunteering.
I'm glad to do it. Lots to learn. I wonder if you have any recommendations for how to have these conversations about ACEs in regards to the parents. So in the case that I'm working, it's an infant, and so there's not a lot to conversation to happen with the child, obviously. But the parents are very young, and they have their own ACEs, not obviously, but not surprisingly. So I don't know if you have any recommendations for the kinds of conversations that we could have as CASA on behalf of the parents in regard to ACEs.
Yeah, I think asking the parents about their own experiences is an important, and it helps you build rapport with them. And then, obviously we're not there necessarily to counsel the parents, but even I've definitely had conversations with parents where I've said, one thing that's interesting that I've learned is that when people have experiences like you shared with me, that, you yourself had been homeless when you were a child. And I've learned sometimes those experiences have a way of impacting us in a lifelong way. What's your opinion on that? Do you see any connections, and asking those conversations with them? But then, also, just having a more kind of, I don't want to say academic, but more of an informative conversation with them of, I've heard about this thing called ACEs. Have you ever heard of it? This is how it can kind of impact. Have you ever thought about this? Have you talked with your counselor about this? And just opening up those conversations. I think it's also important, even when it's a baby, having conversations with them of saying, I'm sure you've realized that because of the abuse you experienced as a child, it's changed the way that you look at parenting. And it's changed maybe the hopes and dreams that you have for your own child. Have you heard about this thing called ACEs? And here's what it means for babies. And so, when babies have a lot of disruptions earlier in their life, even though they might not cognitively remember it the way that we remember things, it can still have impacts on future relationships, and talk about it in that way of kind of saying, hey, what ideas do you have about how we could safeguard your baby against this? What are some ideas you have about your goals for parenting or your goals for where you're going to live? And, kind of framing it around that way. And my style with parents tends to be a very partner type approach with parents of, hey, I think you and I both care a lot about your kid. What can we do to work together to make sure that your child's going to be safe and healthy, and, all the things that you as a parent, like you have this basic assumption of competence and intent, of good intent with that parent. And I think that's a great first step with them of, hey, we've only just met, but I'm guessing that you really care about your child and you want them to be safe and healthy over the course of their entire life. Let's talk about how we could do that together, kind of thing.
Thank you.
Absolutely. How about anyone else?
Hi, Jenny, this is Donna.
Hi, Donna.
Hi. As you were talking, I thought how awesome it would be to have someone, I don't know how else to say it, but teach us how to communicate in a non-threatening way with parents, and even with some of the professionals that we talk to. Is there any training out there for that, especially for, I don't have the personality like you do really to address a parent in the manner that you do, and I would love to learn how.
Yeah, so Tara, write that down for future training. We actually just hosted over the summer a training on communicating with kids during the pandemic. And it was in response to the question, like a question just like yours of, okay, you're telling me I should talk to kids about this. How in the heck do I do that?
Right.
So I can't offhand think of a specific training about that, but I think any training that you could do related to any kind of motivational interviewing, I don't know that necessarily you need to apply all of the concepts of motivational interviewing to a parent. That's a really long training, but any of those concepts are really great at approaching parents as not as adversaries. You're an ally with that parent, right? You can make the basic assumption that most parents have their child's best interest at heart. Most parents love their children. So I think that's any techniques like that are really great. The examples you just saw me giving Lauren are techniques from motivational interviewing. So it's a lot of just leveling with the parent and saying, hey, I've heard about this thing. Are you interested in learning about this thing? I think because I know how much you care about your child, I think that this would be something that would interest you. And it comes from that place of making a basic assumption of good intent and of confidence with that other person. And that applies really well to both parents and other professionals that you work with. Julie suggested the book Difficult Conversations. That's a really good one as well, of just how to approach those sticky kind of situations. But we focus a lot of our training here on how to have those conversations with kids, but I'm looking at you, Tara, because she actually schedules all of our trainings, that we might need to pull one together on practicing those conversations with parents too.
That would be great. I have one more question for you. In some cases, it seems to me like our Job and Family Services isn't open with the parent as far as them not being at the point they need to be for reunification, or even if that can happen. And so the parent thinks every time we go to court, I should be getting my child back now. Is that CASA's, I don't know if responsibility is the right word, but do we have any right to address that, or is it something that we just kind of have to go with, even knowing it's not good?
Yeah, so it's funny. I feel like Tara and I are having a telepathic moment right now, because we have these conversations a lot about, why aren't we addressing this elephant in this room here, or why aren't we wanting to have this that's why we're all together, is to have this difficult.
But we tend to address the elephant.
Yeah, Tara and I are people who tend to bring it up, but so obviously I would definitely recommend that you talk to your local program staff, because each program has a different relationship with their court and a different relationship with their children's services. In general, I think that it is a colossal waste of resources and time for us not to be having the conversations that need to be had. And sometimes it might make sense to start those conversations when you're in maybe a court review, and just kind of look at it almost if you were weighing it out, right? Of, here are the critical high priority things that need to happen in order for reunification to safely occur. And here are the things that have happened. Here are the things that are kind of happening. And here are the things that aren't happening at all. And not necessarily having it as in a conversation of, children's services isn't being straight up with this family. I think, that's a conversation I would let your program staff have, but starting the conversation more in the way of, here are the critical barriers to safe reunification right now. And here's the amount of progress that we're seeing on those, because those are measurable facts. Those are things you can measure and things you can talk about. So I think you do have a responsibility to report those things to the court, to say, here's how I see it. Here are the, top 3 things that need to happen in order for this child to safely go home. And here's the progress on each of those things.
Sometimes there's just going to be professionals that you work with that aren't going to even respond to your motivational interviewing techniques. It's just going to be the way that you're working, and you just continue to do your job, continue to make the recommendations based on a child that you're working with, not based on anything personal with the agency or the professionals that you're working with, and move through that. So it's just about the ability to know that it's not personal. And if you can't change that on the other end, then you can't change it. And we see that too. We see both. We see, a change of conversation style can be helpful to some professionals, or the way that you deliver the information can help. But sometimes nothing does. And it's just something that, just a challenge, kind of a barrier, or whatever we want to call it, in working in this challenging field where everybody has very high emotional opinions and ideas. So we just have to move through that. But it's just us continuing to put forth what we think is in the best interest. And like Jenny said, just kind of very factually, like pointing this out and not going in any personal manner.
Good, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are excellent questions. Any other questions or feedback or things to add? Okay. Tara, anything else that you wanted to share with anyone before we sign off for the day? Well, awesome. I'm glad that so many of you were able to take your, lunch hour or whatever it is that you're doing right now and spend this hour with us. And you'll get an email here that has all the resources. So don't hesitate to reach back out to us if you have a question or you think of something afterwards. But thank you all for continuing to volunteer with CASA and doing all the good that you do. Yeah, Julie, if I'll say goodbye to everyone. And Julie, if you want to stay on, I can address your question. All right, Julie, what's up?
I have a question about the CE credits. I don't know how many I have. And is there a place
Oh,
where I
sorry,
can?
Julie. I know you emailed me that question, but I was a little bit MIA. I had a little bit of an ER accident on Christmas, and I've been a little out of action.
I understand this is a busy time of year.
Mostly when you emailed me that question, I was like, oh my God, Julie's been to like 100 trainings. She's totally fine, is basically what my mind was telling me with that email. But no, I can look back, Julie. It's just a matter of us looking back on our sign-in sheets on training for the year, and you've obviously attended so many.
How many points do the books count for? Those books were really good, by the way.
So the books, I think you can get a total of 3, Jenny, is that right?
2 books for a total of 3 hours. And Julie, yours is actually prorated because you got sworn in May, right? May or June. So you only need half.
I think it was May.
May.
I think it was May. Yeah.
7. So it prorates based on when you came in. But yeah, again, you've attended. I feel like you're at every CASA, so I'm not worried at all about your training hours. But yeah, there's also a place in Optima, but I feel like since the pandemic started, we have not been good about going back into Optima and adding our trainings in there, just because we're not physically together. But yeah,
we have them all available for us to check. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But you don't need to worry.
Well, I just wanted to make sure, but also the books help add to, like I just happened to pick the difficult conversations in the trauma, and then you came out with this and I was like, oh, cool. This really adds to, you know, but I agree that a training on difficult conversations would help, because especially as CASAs, I think that we feel like we know where it's important, but we tend to not push that point when it comes to discussing with our caregivers and parents and things like that. I tend to be more timid probably than what I should be.
And it's like anything, it takes a lot of practice. It does take practice to start all of a sudden